Hello, and welcome to the annual WriteHive conference. This year is jam-packed with a ton of great sessions for writers, writing professionals, and the publishing industry. WriteHive is a nonprofit serving the writing community with resources, events, programming, connections, and more. The 2022 conference brings you this session, Writing Believable Emergencies. I'm Justine Manzano, your moderator for today. To start, I would like to have each of my panelists introduce themselves. Starting with Matt.
Hi, I'm Matthew Phillion. I am an author. I write a superhero series called The Indestructibles, which contains a lot of emergency situations for unbelievable characters. So it's the balancing act there. And I've got some spin-off series that are with that, but I've also been a healthcare writer for a long time. And a cybersecurity writer. So all sorts of emergencies in the other half of my life that I get to write about as well. So I'm happy to share what I know and learn from our fellow panelists.
Hi, I'm Joy Garcia. I'm a captain with the FDNY. I have been serving or working in the city of New York with emergency management, typically doing EMS and covering multiple emergencies, both that have to deal with either psychological or physical issues that may occur in the city or elsewhere. And I look forward to sharing my knowledge with you.
Okay. All right. So to start, I feel like you sort of already said what sort of emergencies you guys have encountered. So what are some ways that emergencies are handled in fiction that make you roll your eyes? Are there like pet peeves, things that you see that you're like, that's not how things work? In any capacity, because like we can talk with Matt specifically, we can go into the cybersecurity stuff too, like anything that you've seen that you're just like, nah.
Joy, I'd love to hear from you first because you've got the first person experience. I've been I write about it, but I'd love to hear your perspective before I jump in, actually.
Oh, surely. Thank you. I think one of the things that make me cringe typically is the usage of equipment and what they do and how it operates. And they're like, oh, we're going to defibrillate and it's going to start their heart. And I'm like, no, that's not how that works. And after that, I cannot read the rest because my head is doing that little glitch of defibrillators actually stop the heart and they hope that your rhythm restarts on its own because of the rhythm. And it only shocks this. So you'll hear the language of, oh, they're in this rhythm and we're going to defibrillate it. I'm like, actually, no, it doesn't work that way. And what happens is when people do read it, what I feel, they think that that's what happens. Or oh, I called 911 and they're here in like 2 seconds. I'm like, that's not real either. What happens? What does our body do in that time and context? And I know I'm jumping around, I'm giving little synopsis, but these are the things that ring true for me. It's, for example, like, oh, they were bleeding for hours and then they passed out. And I'm like, actually, the time frame duration, depending on the wound, you can have that same exsanguination. The blood can just come out depending on what you got injured with, what did it affect? Did it hit an artery? Did it hit a vein? Or I'll read in something alluding to, oh, there's a vein or something or that nature that got struck and you saw bright red blood. And I know it sounds so simple, but an arterial bleed would do that, not a venous bleed. And if you know that and you want to make it believable, and paint your picture, for me, I'll see that and it'll just get me stuck on that line. And I call it the bumper car effect. I'm like, can't read no. And I can't get past that moment because then my brain will only pick up every other time that happens.
It's funny because when you mentioned like how long someone was bleeding or something like that, what gets me is it is possible to find something that can happen to your characters that will let the story happen the way that you want it to. Like if you want them to get injured and still be able to keep fighting on or something, like look up an injury that they can survive for hours with, because those exist, like we're weird creatures. We can survive a lot of trauma, but it just takes a little bit of research to pick the right injury at the time, like watching someone take a sword to the kidney and you're like, that's like that's a lot. Like there are ways that a person can take a horrible injury and still keep fighting John Wick style to the end. It's possible, but it's worth doing that little bit of research to give you some believability. So you don't have to lose anything from your story. but it's tweaking the details, right, to get it right. For me, I have a similar thing with, especially with cybersecurity stuff, where it's not that cool to look at, and which is why I know people do it a certain way, like a lot of emergency response isn't as cool as they want it to look on camera, or like it's very functional, and you just kind of sit there going, oh, that's not what hacking looks like. Or, like, nobody actually wears a hood in a dark room when they're hacking your computer. It's probably some dude in a warehouse with like 8 other guys like writing code. It's not that fun. It's always funny when you actually see someone get it right too, right? If you see a show that's like, oh, they've done the research, or you're reading a book and it's like because then you're like, oh, so they put the work in, just for that little bit of detail that helped. And a lot of people will gloss over it, but for folks like us that actually have been there, a story that I got to, not as a fiction writer, I was interviewing an emergency physician, and when you mentioned defibrillation, my mind also jumped to chest compressions. And how traumatic that is versus what we think it looks like. And he was talking about how he almost don't want the family to see it happening because it can be so hard on the body. And I'm like, well, I'm learning something new, and I'm never going to use that in a story the way that I've ever seen it. But I can't get it out of my head of thinking every time I see it on screen, because he went into the very visceral details about what people might witness in that situation, and just talking to people who have been there, it makes your story that much better,
I think it can definitely add, even in alignment with chest compressions. It is pretty brutal at the rate and depth of compressions that you're doing. If you can just look at AHA guidelines, like, which is where you would go to the leading thought or distributor of information for that injury and or informative thing that you want to add to your story, and say, okay, well, what would I want to do, or what would the body feel if I had to push into it 1/3 of the depth of the chest? And oh, wait a minute, my ribs hold that place and they can break when that happens. And yeah, imagine seeing your loved one having that. It's not as picturesque as most people would paint it in a story. And also knowing that can make the story that much more impactful. If you're saying that, this person was willing to, push the proper depth, rate, and quality. They're not going to say that, but nonetheless, and you heard, the reality of, oh, they felt the bones crack underneath their hands, but they know they were only doing that to make that person live. That's real. That's what happens. I've done it myself. I've seen people give great compressions at the expense of having some ribs broken because of the fragility of our body in that distress.
That's I love that you mentioned that you can make it a better story with that, because we see it all the time on every show that has ever had an emergency has chest compressions. And the idea of, why would you as a writer give up the visceral drama of the ribs cracking, or the fear of if it works or if it doesn't, or how much effort the rescuer has to put into it, because it's not just some kid pounding on it. An 8-year-old is not going to be able to do this. It's you're missing out on an option as a writer by not using that, and just that little bit of detail. And you don't have to. You have to go to a medical journal to learn it either. You can, it's out there for folks to understand in publicly accessible ways too.
Or even when we look at the context of why people are, what you would treat a certain thing in any story. So, we're going to give oxygen. Why? So the person's having difficulty breathing, and if they are having difficulty breathing, and they're having a traumatic injury, yes, oxygen will help, but are they able to perfuse? Are they able to get that distributed through their body? So their body still has the cause that's like a Band-Aid. That's going to help. But really, we have to figure out the valve, the cause, the mechanism is going to definitely lead us up to that. So if you paint a good picture in a story with that, you can see why that little effect can be either used for psychosomatic, like you're saying, hey, I'm going to give you this because the person who's panicking doesn't know that. And you can add that in your story. I'm going to give them oxygen, knowing that, if it was a medic or a person aiding care in a story, knowing that this will give them the distraction and the calm. It will help, but I really have to fix the main problem. And that buys me enough time to go and actually implement that care.
And especially if we're talking about not like novels or prose writing versus television, where you have the option of giving sort of an internal perspective from the caregivers or the professional's perspective, you can have that thought process from your lead character or the lead character in the moment going, this isn't going to have a physical impact, but I need this person to be calm. And if I give them, if I put the mask on, maybe it'll help them stop panicking. And that makes it almost adds a heroic element to like their skill level too, by mentioning something like that. And it's a missed opportunity to not do it. It's like, just slap a mask on them and they'll be better. Why? Tell us why. And people like to know why. People enjoy, people are forgiving of mistakes, but in fiction, but it also, I think they really love the realism too. It helps them with engagement and with really feeling a part of the story.
And connection. You get to connect because you can see that that person was perhaps not able to fix the physical injury or ailment, but they cared enough to invest the extra momentum to see, okay, but I'm going to handle their emotional or psychological psyche. This person needs an ER, not anything that I'm doing right now, but I'm going to do this because this is all I need to do. This is all I have. It's almost as in the stories when they're like, okay, there's a delivery. The dad, go boil a pot of water. The water does not do anything. It just gets dad out of the room long enough for you to be able to do what you need to do.
Speaking of labor,
Yes.
when I had my son, I encountered many things that I thought happened a certain way based on TV and movies, and oh my goodness, was that wrong. For one thing, your water may break and you will be waiting forever still to have a baby. Sometimes it doesn't break. I was in the hospital for 36 hours before I ended up getting a C-section. And in none of that time did any water break. It just didn't happen. There's just a lot of that. Like long before, you're not like, it is very rare that you are sitting there going, oh, I'm in labor. Oh, I better give birth to this baby right now in the back of the car. Like, unless there's something serious going on, like it's not happening that fast. You're not stuck in like 10 minutes of traffic and, oh, that's the difference between the baby being born and in the car and in the hospital. Like that's not a thing that happens. Also, I personally I am a huge fan of the person who's giving CPR to the guy who's like bleeding out on the floor. Like, why? Like, that you're not helping.
I'm curious for both of your perspectives, especially yours, right? The way that I think writers tend to, if they've seen it in another show or in another book, they think they can just take what they've seen in fiction and not do any research themselves, and things become kind of popular. Like, I mean, obviously, giving birth is huge, and every Hollywood writer thinks they can write a delivery scene because they've seen a bunch of movies with it, as opposed to having been there themselves. But one of the ones that comes up, because it must have been in a show and then everybody decided to do it, is it a tracheotomy? Is it when you clear the hole in the throat to enable them to breathe? It felt like that got real popular real fast, and every time I see it, I'm like, that is so traumatic. That is so traumatic. I mean, it can save a life, but it's not easy or simple. And it felt like a ton of writers just went, I saw that looked really cool, I'm going to put it in my book or in my show, and didn't actually do any sort of research about how it works to be able to describe it.
Right. And those procedures are super invasive, and the trauma from the procedure itself let alone the infection and the healing thereafter, are not always considered in writing. Like, you see a lot of people, they're like, we're going to get a pen and we're going to get a razor blade from like my old shoelace that I use like to do things with the gym, and I'm going to do that, and that's going to make it. And I'm like, that's not going to happen. No, there's so much vasculature there that you just leave them the way they are, because that's not going to do what you think is going to happen. Or everyone's like, go get the tourniquet. I'm like, really? No. Did we apply pressure? Tourniquets are also just like that, very popular, very
every
popular.
I was gonna ask you because every time I see it, it gives me pause. Like, is that that's not the right situation to use them. That's not gonna, he's gonna lose that arm, man. Like that is not the right way to do it.
And you have to think about like your time and distancing. So in a story, if you're writing and the hospital is rural, then I can see why you would utilize a tourniquet. And also same piece of equipment, different devices. So different usages. So let's say you got a snake bite, because we were talking about snakes prior before recording. Let's say if you got a snake bite and you want to stop the poison from going, well, find out what the venom, where your anti-venom center is. Think about logistics in your story and what would be in that area. Are medevac options open? Think about your emergency resources that will respond typically in that storyline that you're doing. Granted, if it's something that you can create, then fine, and make that available so that it can stop the I guess the fallacy of, oh, yeah, so we're in rural Pennsylvania and we got to the hospital in 10 minutes. No, you didn't. Stop. No, you did not.
There are some places you will not make it to the hospital. You will not
happen. Like the anti-venom center, and I believe it's still the only anti-venom center in New York right now, is Jacobi Medical Center. And that's because it's close to the Bronx Zoo. So even a little nice nifty trip for that is, why would this place have that? Oh, because we have a whole zoo that has the anti-venom for the location. Knowing what hospital has the resources also may add to your story. You're like, yeah, that's believable, because why would you take them if they're having a heart attack? Why would you take them to a stroke center? They need to go to the cardiac center. The tourniquet effect, going back a little bit, is think about why you're using that. Did you try everything first? And I do see, to add to that, knowing that the protocols change, because I think that's why we call it the study of medicine and the practice of medicine. It doesn't say you're in medicine. No, you're part of a thing that's evolving and growing constantly. I mean, if we didn't learn anything from this whole pandemic, we learned that we know just enough to get us through, but not everything. And we still have so much more to learn. So with something like a tourniquet, why am I applying it? How long will it be on? And what is the goal? What's the purpose of it? Did I try any other measures? And that can add more suspense to the story. Like, oh, I'm applying pressure. I tried to, compress the artery and it was still going. And also know that the human body is, at most 5 liters of blood in there. So when you say, oh my God, gallons and gallons of blood came out, no, it did not. No matter how, a person may be shaped or size, we don't have that in there. So that's when my eyes start twitching. I'm like, no, that didn't happen. Unless it's a creature or something that does that, and then go run with it, do the thing.
I'm now picturing like a gallon of milk and thinking gallons and gallons. Like, oh my gosh.
How much milk could that actually, if there's going to be some writing advice, it's like, think about the amount of, specifically blood, because we're talking about it here, but like, now picture the real world. Someone not related to healthcare, but like picturing how much weight someone lost. Like, okay, go look at a pound of steak and think about, you lost a pound this week and you don't feel good about it. Like, look at a pound of steak and that's how much dropped off your body. I'm like, okay, that's, because you have the visual element. And like a gallon of milk, like, okay, you've written a murder mystery and someone's been, disensanguinated and all of their blood's on the floor. Like, now picture pouring 5 gallons of milk on the floor, and that's all you're going to get. And it's a lot, but that's all you're going to get. By the way, I wanted to say that I think this entire session is worth anybody listening to, just to learn the factoid that the reason that the only anti-venom center in New York is close to the Bronx Zoo, like that is such a cool, like, I hope everybody listening to this just writes that down. Like, that's the coolest. Just
anti-venom, Bronx Zoo, got it.
But you're mentioning like how far things away. I've written a lot about healthcare deserts in the country, and that's like it's not just. I did a couple of recent articles where they were talking about it's a portable ultrasound machine. Like it's pocket size. It fits in a fanny pack. They call it, so the doctor that I was talking to, I call it my scanny pack.
That's so cute.
It's very great. But I'm talking to 2 doctors using them, and one of them was using them in Yemen, and one of them was using in Michigan, and it was because, okay, war zone. Where you need portable technology, but at the same time, there's parts of the US where you're 50 miles or 100 miles from the healthcare that you need. And if you're writing about an emergency in a specific part of the country, knowing what their access is. I'm in the Boston area, so there's a hospital every 10 feet. You can't, you know, throw a Dunkin' Donuts cup out your car window and not hit a hospital around here. But other parts of the country, you can be infinitely more at risk for even like a minor injury, just because you can't get there. There's just not access to it.
Right. And in addition to that, if I may add, then you see in your characters, what does the community know? Because our resources are not able to get there within time. So you'll see that the mom and pop shop is also your first aid place.
Mhm.
That's also the place that has all of the things that you're going to need, because your hospital, you're getting there via helicopter. I recently had an experience where it was on a hike, and it's very mountainous and there's rocks, and the resources that were met there were not just one resource. It actually was a tri-state response, because one portion on that border had the Stokes basket, which is a big piece of equipment. So keeping up with the terms of what equipment is available, like the Scanny Pack, or an iStat, which takes a drop of blood and can analyze it right on scene and tell you if someone has something that you have to be exposed to, or that they need something and you deliver them. That's really awesome, unless you're going to make one up in your story, which is also something you can add. But knowing what's going to respond to what, and in that case, me being a higher medical authority and what I have, they were still working with me because they know that I still have the highest level of training. Mm-hmm. Yet all of them, the fire resources and the EMS resources, all brought a different component to move one person. Mm-hmm. And thinking about how they all have to work, and then where is that person going to get transported thereafter? So thinking, I think, outside of the box of where you want your emergency to happen, and who's going to respond, and what's going to be utilized, and what would you create to make it that more impactful in your story, I think is really important.
I was thinking, you reminded me of, I had a friend who was on an island a couple of hours off the coast of Maine. She was a teacher there, and she told me they had no police department, no real fire department, and no doctor. There was a vet. So if you got in trouble, you could go to a vet. And I have a friend who was a vet for years and years, and she used to joke around like, I want to see a human surgeon be able to do kidney surgery on a snake. She's like, I could do it on like 80 different species, and he could only do one. Haha. But knowing what your access is, right? Like if you're out in the middle of nowhere, you might be going to the local dentist because they're the only one who has any kind of medical training at all in a space like that. I was like, and you've mentioned the idea of like making something up a couple of times, like for a story. And I write sci-fi and fantasy, so that happens a lot. But what drives me nuts, having a little bit of a background as a healthcare writer, is don't make something up that might already exist, or find out what's out there and figure out a way to improve it. Because a lot of times writers will think I've got this clever thing, and like, that exists, man. Like that exists. Real. You didn't make that up. That actually exists. And if you know what the options are, and you're trying to be futuristic, or you're trying to solve a problem in a story that you don't know how to solve, find out what's out there that you can use that's real. Or if you go, okay, I need something that's that next level, and the story's taking place 50 years from now, there might be something different. There might be, instead of a turning, there might be what was it? There was some substance that we use now for toys that was actually used to fill bullet holes during World War I or World War II. It might have. I don't know the name of that, but I know we have something called Quick Clot, and we do stuff it in things to stop the bleeding. there was, and that's the modern version. There was actually I wish I could remember, because it was one of those ones like, wow, that's actually what we did with that.
I feel like I've heard it too, and I can't come up with the name.
It's used in like toys or crafts now, but like, and that existed 80 years ago. Mm-hmm. It's better now, but doing a little bit of background before you start writing, because you can be an even cooler writer if you know the real thing, and then you go, okay, so where's this going to be in 50 years? Will there be more portable antivenom stuff? Will there be aerosols instead of other things, so that mask that you want to put on your character might actually have an effect, that doesn't exist now. And not doing enough research to know that you're not making something up that doesn't exist is huge, and that drives me bonkers too, because it's not, just look at it, Google it. I want something that does this, and it'll pop right up, and it'll be a healthcare company's marketing campaign that pops up, and it'll tell you all about it too. It's
Or the same with a lot of what the military does, because we do in emergency management, we look at what the military does, because they're operating in zones that are truly distressing. And we take a lot of that information to treat patients that we have here in, rural or city areas. And so with that, look at what the newest tech, services are offering the military, and who's campaigning for what, because that will be utilized, in a town near you. It's going to happen. So we have to see what's going to work.
That's a great point, because they're often the testing ground for new technology in healthcare. Sometimes because they've got the funding for it, like through DARPA or something like that, or sometimes because they need it first, because they're in those dangerous situations. And eventually, when it becomes normalized and affordable, then cities and towns start getting it, and the local municipalities, local hospitals can get it. So it trickles down to everybody else later on. But yeah, if you look into the future, look at what the military is doing in terms of like field medicine, and you might find some cool stuff that might be commonplace in 10 or 15 years or beyond, with just a little bit of, and it's not boring research either. It's a lot of fun to read about. So it's actually worthwhile as a writer just to kind of geek out about some of the stuff that's actually happening in the real world before you start making stuff up.
I feel like it's really important to, because you and I, Matt, we're both writing in fantasy situations and sci-fi type things. So it's really important to consider not taking it so far out of believability too, because you want to make sure that while you can make things happen that defy the laws of physics, yes, but if there's not a reason for that, then you're screwing up. You have to have an explanation for things that don't work the way they should be working, because I think a lot of people feel like, oh, it's fantasy, I don't have to do any research, it's I just have to, I make it all up, and that's what you do when you're writing fantasy or when you're writing sci-fi. But it's no, you still have to do research, because you're still dealing with people. And even if you're dealing with alien people or supernatural people, if you're not dealing with something that relates to humanity, you're not doing your job, because the reader won't be able to connect. So there's so much, it's so important to be able to do your research and to understand how things should work before you break those rules, which is also something I say about writing. And I just realized that now. I always say, when you're learning writing rules, you can't break them until you know them. Yeah. Same thing.
That's great advice on both counts too. Is you have to learn the basics, and then you can start improvising a bit. And it's funny that you bring up the whole idea of fantasy, and I found that the more I understand about real health care stuff, the things that you'll see in fantasy, oh, he drinks a magic potion and it heals him. I'm I want to know how, because medicine is amazing. And it's how does it, does it, if somebody casts a spell that heals someone, I'm do we watch the bone knit? Because that would be rad. I want to see, does it do what real world medicine would do, but faster? And that can add an element of visceral excitement to the story, rather than just video game, he gets his hit points back. It's come on, I want to know, that's for games. This is a story. Make it powerful, make it impactful. I wanted to sneak back to the beginning question of things that drive us crazy, because I it was one of those ones that I thought of that I wanted to bring up at the beginning. Getting knocked out.
Oh
yes,
because that brain trauma is real bad.
Really, really bad.
And it's a favorite thing for writers, if they don't know how to end a scene, the guy gets clobbered in the head and then wakes up later on, and I'm is he vomiting? Can he see out of both eyes clearly?
Is pupil dilated?
Yeah.
Is he concussed?
Yeah.
What other trauma does he have? A subdural bleed? what's going on here?
That might be, of all the things that we've talked about, I think getting knocked unconscious might be my biggest pet peeve, because it's so commonly used in writing, and it's so dangerous.
I was just thinking, because you have your Batman behind you. So we were talking about this before we started recording, but the lovely Batman on your wall.
My Batman and Robin cartoon behind me right now.
It's so good. But the number of hits Batman takes,
Oh yeah.
and the things that happen to him throughout the course of the series. I know it's like an ever restarting story, but like he should not be okay. Like, he's had his back broken, he's been knocked out like several times, poisoned. Like, they should be just hot messes. Everyone in Gotham should be like,
one of my
like lung trouble, brain trauma. Like, how? Like,
one of my favorite throwaway lines is from Into the Spider-Verse, the Miles Morales Spider-Man animated film, when the older Spider-Man is going through his life story, and he's walking around, he's got a pot belly, he's slower, and he's like, blah 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 blah, broke my back, bounced back, and it was like, and he just mentioned like, okay, so he suddenly has back trouble for the rest of his career because he had a spinal injury, and they just acknowledged it, and I'm like, that made me so happy as a writer, like, that even poor Spider-Man who falls off of buildings all the time, can have a back injury, and then that impacts his ability to be a hero later on. And it's still a fun character. You're not taking away the magic of the story. But when I heard that, I almost cheered when I heard him, like, yes, thank you for acknowledging this poor guy falls off of buildings. He's probably got some bone damage in there, or nerve damage,
Like, as somebody who's had spinal surgery, like, it's not fun times. It hurts. It hurts you at random. You're like walking around and you're just kind of like, it's raining. It's going to rain. Yep. And your whole back feels it. Like, that's not something that you can just sort of like walk it off.
Have there been any, I have one in particular that I think of, but have either of you come across stories where where injuries and stuff actually, where you felt like it was done well, like you could feel the struggle of the character who might have gone through? Because I'm thinking of, the one I think of is, I'm pretty sure like 87 chapters in the Harry Potter series involves him getting knocked out, and I'm like, this poor kid is going to be messed up by the end of the story, because he's been knocked out like 75 times. Like, that's, they take you out of the boxing ring if you get knocked out that many times. You have to retire. Is there any ones that jump to mind where you're like, okay, that did well?
I have to cut you off because you stole my question. You're doing my job for me.
Sorry.
That was actually my next question, was if you could think of any stories that you've seen, or anything like pop culture related that you were like, okay, thank you. Like what you just said about Miles Morales, like that moment in that Spider-Man movie was like, yes, yeah, that's how it works. Thank you.
He's going to have a pot belly because he's not going to be able to do crunches anymore.
Yeah, like, okay, like thank you for acknowledging that. Do you, Joy, or can you think of any off the top of your head?
At the moment, because I've been really in, at least for the past year, super medical, studying in my medical books, I don't have a concrete story, but what I would say is I have the sentiment and remembering the feeling of when it was done, and it validated the situation. So although we've been talking about trauma and other injuries, we often overlook the psychological effects. So when someone writes a story about someone with dementia or Alzheimer's, and they put it in such a perspective of what the character, like the caregiver and the role strain that's happening, and you can hear what it does to the family and how it can bring them up together, or more often than not breaks them apart, and shows what's going on. I've appreciated that. I've appreciated when people see how diabetic emergencies evolve into different circumstances, or when a picture is painted in such a way that it's not always going to, I'll just relate it to the textbooks where they're saying, well, your patient will have the sense of impending doom. This is a real line in most medical and EMS textbooks, like, both EMTs or BLS or ALS, advanced life support, they'll feel impending doom. I have not had one patient in my span of 20 plus years say, I feel like I'm having impending doom. When they do say that I'm having difficulty and distress in a way that's actually relatable. And I've seen and read stories that show that. I know that the person either has gone to it, it makes it more relatable, or gone through it, or they've done their research to show the impact of, oh, they had a surgery. It takes 6 to 8 weeks to typically heal. And that's the minimum of something. And then when it paints a picture of the journey within that and what happens and how they heal or how their mental effect by that said injury happens, I relate to it more because that's life. That's actually what's happening. Even when I have to refer to your story, Justine, because I've been using it as my escapism when all these things are going on this week. But when Jacqueline heals someone, it's not like she's like, oh, I'm going to go and heal someone and I'm fine. No, she gets drained. She gets tired, because you would think about it. When you're doing something of that nature, you're going to have that effect. You're going to have that. To give something to heal, you might lose something yourself. Stories like that definitely affect what I feel make it relatable, believable. And even when it comes to something like I've read and seen stories, I don't have reference points. I'm not really good with that. But what I will say is when someone's going through alcohol withdrawal, that's a real emergency.
Yeah, it's not just, oh, they stopped drinking and they're being babies about it. Like you
change your body chemistry.
Yeah. DTs, like that's a real emergency. It should be handled as such. And I've seen it so often on television where they're just like, meh. So when someone shows that, no, the doctors go in and they're going to take care of that patient, and you see that they're really vectoring their care to all the platforms. And so often it's a group of people that are often overlooked for whatever the reason. That care is still just as important. So when a story is dedicated to that whole process, even if the character was 2 pages long and it's really just a side story or a part of it that was witnessed by the main character as they're walking by, that's important. When someone's giving Narcan to someone, and let's say if it's a superhero walking down a really bad place and they see, oh, I've seen this person I've seen more Narcan administered down this block than I can witness. That's a real thing that happens. And so when those little details that may not even be part of your story are there, it just makes it so much more real. And I miss my characters when when I'm reading a story later on, when the book is gone, they're still with me. Okay. I need to go back to those pages and be like, well, what happened with this person? Because I miss them, no matter what their story is. So when you say that, I relate to that person that was on that corner getting Narcan, because I've seen it, and other people who've witnessed it or want to really know what your story is, they'll become enveloped with it if you paint the picture that more clearer.
It's interesting that you say that. See, I've been doing several panels. I think I've worked on 5 panels this year. This is the only, I'm not technically a panelist on this one. I was a panelist and a moderator on the others, but it's been a theme. So we were doing this one. We talked about dealing with action scenes in one of them. We talked about dealing with mental health and how that works, and trauma in children's literature and how that's handled. And for all 3 of those ones that I've done, it's the same vibe of what you just said, which is having real things that happen to people and dealing with them in a real way makes the people who've experienced it or witnessed things like that feel seen. And it helps the story and it helps the people reading the story. So it's a huge thing to give, real stakes to an issue. So I had, I mentioned I had spinal surgery. Weird things will happen when you talk about medical, like real medical stories, because people who, and not to knock on the publishing industry completely, but there are people who have not experienced these things and know what they see on TV and know what they see from what they're exposed to in pop culture, literature, and things like that. And will say, that's not how it works. I gave a full retelling of the spinal surgery that I had in a story and was told that's not how the spinal surgery was done. Cool. I've really interesting. I have also had the situation where the story wasn't about the spinal surgery. The story was about the anxiety surrounding the spinal surgery. And I had a couple of publishers say that that was unrelatable. And I'm like, no, it's not. Because when you find out that someone is going to be messing around in your spinal area, you assume you're coming out of that thing paralyzed. It's a fucked up way to think, but it is what happens. And it is a scary thing. You're not going to look at it and go, okay, I'm having spinal surgery. I'm sure the doctors know what they're doing. And just
medicine in general, I'll never forget, because you're talking about like spinal surgery, big thing, but it can be even the little traumas that stick with you. I'll never forget, the dentist was required to play a video for what could happen if the wisdom tooth extraction goes wrong. And that's just wisdom teeth. Like, most people have their wisdom teeth taken out at some point, right? It's like, if we mess up, you might be blind, or your jaw will be paralyzed, or you might lose your hearing. And I'm like swaying in my seat. I mean, maybe it's the writer thing where you can picture the bad real clearly. And I'm like, I might pass out of panic right now. And it's like, this is just teeth. Like, this happens to everybody all the time. And the reality of how scary medicine can be for the person on the receiving end. I think that fear, we're not great in a lot of times in society and in our writing in addressing the reality of the fear of knowing what's happening but not fully understanding it. And you can actually play that to your advantage as a writer too, if you don't want to fully understand what happens when you take a bullet or something, but knowing how scary it is to know something's wrong in here. You know, we're this big beautiful machine, but we don't know what parts are going on. We're never, hopefully, if you're lucky, you never get to see the parts that are inside of you, right? Like, if you're lucky, you never get to see the gears that are going on. But just the mystery of what's inside of the human body, and when something traumatic happens to you that you have no control over, and the reliance on the person who's hopefully going to rescue you in some way. That's a powerful connection that it's okay to rely on too as a writer. You can flip. One of the pieces of advice I've always had is if for emergencies is if you don't understand the mechanics of what's actually happening, it's okay to flip the perspective to someone who is like you and doesn't understand, and just observe what's happening. And you don't have to give all the nitty-gritty details. You can write from the receiving person's perspective, and just observe and feel that fear or anxiety and kind of lean in on that a little bit. If you're afraid of writing about the specific, the medical side of things, if you're a little intimidated about getting into the nitty-gritty of that part, limit the perspective.
Yeah, you don't need to know all of the pieces of the car to know when your car is breaking down.
What is that noise?
Yeah, exactly.
The engine light is on. It's enough.
Yeah, if something is wrong with you, you know, and when you do, that's scary. That's and your brain goes, especially in a world where we see so much. Because like if you're dealing with people who are not exposed to a lot, like if they're remote in some way and just don't like encounter a lot, there's a different vibe. But in a world where we're like in current day and we know everything that's happening everywhere at all times, like it's really scary when you've heard 7 different stories of people who just don't go to sleep during anesthesia.
Yeah, that's the danger as a writer right now, is the excessive amount of information. You have to be your own fact checker. You know, like WebMD should not be your first and final stop.
WebMD, you will forever think you're dying of cancer. Yeah, WebMD makes everyone think they're dying of cancer.
And that's not going to help you as a writer too. I get some of the things that change. I wanted to kind of cycle back because you mentioned the trauma of writing clearly about trauma and recovery, and I always kind of lose it when, like, you know, that person should not be walking yet. Like, it's been 24 hours there, but I know that because it's funny because I remember, I think Sting, the writer, actually said there's grammatically correct and there's musically correct. Where like you know how you write grammatically correct, but sometimes you got to break the rules. And I think there's scientifically correct, and sometimes it's just tough to tell a story. Like, you can't have your character in bed for a month while they recover from surgery. That's not great storytelling. The question is, do you change the story so that you compress the time? Do you pick a different injury? So if you want the hero walking out of the hospital the next day, maybe, not a brain, maybe not getting shot in the head, you know what I mean, like something like that, but choose something that, if you want the story to go a certain way, find a situation where what you need them to do afterwards is believable. I'm always rolling my eyes. That's like, they should still be hooked up to an IV. They should not, they're not even getting out of bed to use the bathroom yet. Like, that's that person should not be walking out at the final scene of the movie with just a cane. Like, oh, I'm good. Just got a little bit of a limp. No.
No, or they're ready to fight the next fight. Like, they're like, oh, we're ready for that. I'm like, no, you're not. You still haven't gotten over the first fight that happened like 2 chapters ago.
Right.
So that's not going to work. And sometimes you do have to pick and choose from what I, feel like you'll be able to have more believable aspects to it if you integrate that, oh, this happened, or they did this and that helped, because there's a lot of, we'll have American medicine, but there's a lot of integrative medicine that you can do a lot of different things. There's breathing techniques that can accelerate your heart rate if you needed to wake up in the morning. There's so many different ways you can actually make your body, it's really receptive to change and what you want to implement it. And it doesn't always have to be the traditional way. And then look into resources that will guide you in that aspect. And I'm sure that will support it. If I may just go back to something that Justine had said earlier, and it was something about when we were doing cardiac arrest management with trauma. So when writing things of that nature, if you're going to make the story something similar to doing CPR on someone who lost all the blood, then add to the story to know why we would do CPR in cardiac arrest management. Because if you plan on saying, oh, they received blood and then they did a cardiac massage, and then there was enough electrical activity to pick up and make that mechanical pump work because you gave it everything that it had and you created the environment for it, then you're like, oh yeah, that can happen. Is it rare? Yes. Does it mean that they have to crack open that chest? And then when they do all of that, that their risk for infection is through the roof, and the fact that they walk out of that ER is a miracle? Yes, but it has happened. I've had patients that has happened too. Rare, but if you want to make that miracle story part of your story, look up the miracles. They happen. They're there. That's what makes, and when you read something like that and it's written well, you're like, yes, they got that one story with all of those things, and it happened. And they painted it so well that you're like, oh, I'm gonna have to read their next description of whatever they're painting.
Or you can just have a character that heals things. I mean,
honestly,
I may have done that because I didn't want characters to not be able to fight in their next fight.
One of my favorite things, because it's, when you have the cheat, because you're writing about heroic characters and you want them, so sometimes, well, he heals really fast. And one of those lines that stuck with me forever was an early, like from when I was a kid, Wolverine comic, where it's a throwaway line, and he says every time the claws come out, he goes, and yes, it hurts every time. And I'm like, that's a detail where, okay, so if he heals so fast that the cuts where the blades come out of his hand heal up, and he re-injures himself every time he does it, that is such a I was probably 11 when I read that, and I'm 45 and I still remember it. Like, that is a powerful detail of like, okay, so here's a guy who can heal, so you get the cheat. He falls out of an airplane, he just needs a minute, just need a minute to put myself back together and I'm okay. But the detail of like, okay, healing very quickly, but feeling pain through everything. And another writer pointed out that the only thing that Wolverine is afraid of is drowning, because he'd keep reviving and then drowning again and reviving and drowning again, because if he ever got stuck in like, so now you've added a fear to the you've created an out as a writer. I got a character who can heal, but what are they afraid of? Because sometimes that could be a curse too.
Mhm.
And those were two things that just stuck with me for a character who is a perfect cheat for how he can get back up and fight again. I mean, I prefer characters who actually need, I could take a month off, like I broke my hand. Like I can't punch anybody for at least a month. I broke every finger in my left hand. I can't do it.
Mhm.
But if you want to have those concessions, and another one that I remember specifically, and I didn't know this because I never played the video games. I never I got it, but the apparent in the old Witcher novels, the original stuff, he has ongoing injury trauma that so he has chronic pain, and we're still having trouble acknowledging that people have chronic pain in real life, let alone in fiction.
Yes.
As
Yeah.
someone who suffers from a chronic pain illness, I will say that that's one thing that when it comes to characters that have, like what you said with Wolverine and with Witcher, yeah, okay, you can go through that over and over again, and oddly, you'll react less in pain
because you're built up
used to it.
You're just used to it. It's not even like it doesn't hurt anymore. It's just like it's just it's
New
again.
normal.
Yeah. And it's one of the characters that I write. I she's if I because I knew a lot of dancers growing up, a lot of ballerinas when I was younger, and the injuries that they would dance through would make a professional football player retire. Like I had a friend who broke every toe in her foot and just taped them up and went out and performed. So one of my characters is, what if Batman was a ballerina? Instead of a rich playboy, it's just a dancer who, instead of dancing, goes into superheroing, because that's the level of pain and strength that someone who's in chronic. And it's funny because I never really put two and two because I live with someone with chronic pain, so I it's top of mind, and I didn't think of it until just now in this conversation. Like, oh, I've got a character who does that thing. But acknowledging the long term and the new normal of someone in pain. I was really impressed that somehow this character, who really doesn't have the best reputation for being socially aware, with the Witcher character specifically, like, oh, wait a minute, so they've actually addressed that he's got a chronic injury that never goes away, and he's just constantly dealing with this low grade pain all the time, like a human does. That's fantastic. I'm really interested in that. And doing a little bit of research about, because there's no shortage of people that are going through it. You can talk to them, interview them, have a conversation, buy them a cup of tea, and ask them about how they get through life.
I'm available for the cup of tea. Pick my brain about. I mean, I sound like a hot mess because I've been like through this whole conference between all of my, let's talk about trauma, let's talk about pain, and how let's talk about emergencies, and I'm like, oh yeah, I relate to all of this. I'm like, people are going to be like calling the therapist
but that's what makes you relatable, and it's your humanity. I think also, if you take the perspective of, some people will make those same experiences weaknesses in some of their stories, and in fact it's both. It can feel like a weakness from a perception of out, and it could feel like a strength from the person who's on the reverse side, or, but if you flip it around. So knowing the angle of how you want to make the story, depending on what their emergency experience is and or illness or ailment is, can definitely, like people who have sickle cell anemia, that's a lifelong experience, and they're often painted in certain stories as looking for another fix of medication. Well, think about it. Your cells are literally shaped like sickles, and they hook onto each other, and they go through the same way, that, the same valve, causing lots of discomfort at a cellular level. I don't think that anyone who doesn't have that experience can determine what they're there for, or what their mental anguish, and or when they wake up on a good day, you cannot tell them it's a bad day, because that's their damn good day. Yeah. So when we have those stories, we have to be able to look into it, and then look at the aspects that this is the norm of the way that we present things. And then you can look at the anomalies that happen within those things. And there are people, you know, I have my own autoimmune issue,
Mhm.
and I have a lot of the things that I'm not supposed to have. And I'm still here, present, and able to work through that. That is not to use my story as the main basis as who I am, but there are other people who have that same experience. And they're able to say, well, I am able to go this far with it, knowing your illness, ailment, or injury, and say, yeah, I know it's supposed to present this way. And then you develop the story, but they don't have that because of whatever it is.
Or just they have it and it doesn't have the same effect. Like how do they counteract? Because especially when it comes to Joy and I know each other outside of this, so Joy will understand what I'm talking about. The number of times that me or my husband or another member of our family have been told that we can't have something because we're too young is like, my husband has glaucoma. He's had it since he was in his 20s. And they misdiagnosed him about 7 different ways. He had to go through all kinds of tests that didn't do anything, didn't find anything, because they were like, it can't be this simplest thing because he's only 25. Like, it can't be that. It's, yeah, okay. But sometimes medicine doesn't act the way it's supposed to. Sometimes your body just does stuff. And, you know, yeah, we're talking about, okay, so we're talking about writing believable emergencies. And I'm saying, well, sometimes the rules just, yeah, that's true. But knowing how the rules sometimes don't work is part of it too.
Yeah, it gives you the flexibility. It gives you the flexibility to say, okay, if I am writing a story within that context, where are my sometimes? You will be looking for that sometimes to add into it. And you know, it's something that, you know, building on something that was said earlier, we are made in a way not to fail. Like if we just go, like if I get nerdy with it, and I'll be brief, but with our heart and the mechanism of how our electrical activity has, there is a backup to the backup to the backup. So there's an intrinsic rate of how your heart rate should be. And then there are so many other backups to try to make sure that we are working.
Because your body will course correct.
It's one of the things that in writing fantasy and, you know, trying to come up with other species and stuff like that, pointing out how resilient we are compared to other real creatures. Like a horse breaks its leg, it's dead. A human, we have like evidence of cavemen breaking their legs and just keep on going. You know, we're in a lot of ways, we're kind of horrifyingly efficient creatures compared to other, you know, like a rabbit can be startled to death. We go to movies to scare the hell out of ourselves for fun.
Roller coasters.
You know? We go to roller coasters,
exactly.
You know? Like you're right. The level that I love that you mentioned that, like, we're built not to fail because and that's why I think that's why when writers don't do that extra step to say, okay, you couldn't get back up from this, it bothers me, because there's so much we can get back up from. There's a lot that I mean, you hear about people with parachutes failing and they hit the ground and bounce. My kid brother fell asleep at the wheel. He'd been working an overnight, didn't have a seatbelt on. I'll always get mad at him for that. But he fell asleep and went through the front windshield of his car, but he didn't wake up. And no internal injuries. He fractured 3 bones that you can't set. I think it was the clavicle, his ribs, and his pelvis fractured, and got road rash. And they said, well, if he was awake, he would have died because he would have broke his neck, because he would have tensed up. But he just ragdolled and bounced along the street. And I mean, it was traumatic and humiliating because he fell asleep and almost died. But considering what could have happened, and it's like the human body's amazing. He bounced. The most physical pain he was in was from the road rash, because a poor nurse had to go in and like pull out the gravel. Which
painful, I hear.
Which I was in the room for, and he just kept looking at me because they numbed him up, and he's looking at me going, how bad is it? Because the noises she's making. He's looking at me going, because she's going, oh, and he goes, I don't even want to look. I don't want to look, because he went through the windshield of his car. But you're right, we're built not to fail. Like, that's car crashes, emergency car crashes. There's so many ways that a car crash will kill you, but we hear about people surviving all the time too.
All the time. I would respond to something and the car would tumble over itself and be like a sardine can, and the
Mhm.
person's like, I don't want to go to the hospital. I'm like, really? Okay. Well, you really should, because, considering that you can get back in that car if you wanted to, because it no longer looks like a car, we're going to need to assess you further, because you're going to make sure that all the things are doing what they're supposed to. And not to mention, in alignment with that, adrenaline is very deceptive.
Amazing.
And we have to incorporate that. There are moms who have moved cars with the sheer adrenaline because their child was going to get hit, or I have, people with impaled objects, and they're just like, hey, and I'm like, no, you're not just hey, something else. You have something that is in you now that you didn't wake up with this morning, and we need to make sure that we stabilize it so that it doesn't move any of the things that you're supposed to have.
It's no, you're not hey, no hey.
And
And just the remarkable nature of the human body. But I mean, same brother, by the way, tried to break up a fight in the street, which is always taking your own life in your hands. And someone hit him with a milk crate. Is that what the plastic things
Yes.
like that? And to it, I will never forget his friend afterwards talking to us, going, "Who hit someone with a milk crate?" Like, but we get a call from the hospital because he ran to the hospital with his head wrapped in a t-shirt because he was bleeding. And we get a call, or my parents get a call, and then they call me because the family, gave him a telephone, that he had a broken neck. He got in a fight and he has a broken neck because he had, there was, I think it was a fracture to one of the vertebrae, but he walked to the hospital. They could do nothing to treat it other than, could you stay still for a couple of weeks, kid? And I'm on the road when I get the call going, okay, so we're gonna have to build a ramp because we're gonna help him get in and out of the house. And I'm on construction level, how to take care of him for the rest of his life. And then I find out he checked himself out early because he felt fine and just went home. He took a cab home because he was fine with 3 stitches in his head. And I'm like, I'm never going to forget the panic that I had. I was probably more afraid than he was, but B, like the human body, the same person who has gone through the roof, through the windshield of the car, had his neck broken, and he's still walking around. He's healthier than I am.
Which is ironic, because that same injury could take someone out. And the other aspect of it, of knowing, so that even from that perspective, where your character is, I'm fine, right? There's a couple that word, I would love to take it out of the vocabulary, because we know everyone who says I'm fine is usually not fine. And that is in all levels. Good morning. How was your day? Oh, it's good. No, you're fibbing. You're not. And I'm fine. You're not fine. Stop. I mean, we may not have the reality to be able to express that in emergency situations, but a lot of medical care professionals will go and insist on, you're going to be okay. We can never promise that, because we don't know. The person that came in with a splinter could not be okay in an hour. And the person who, obviously had something more distressing can be relatively well. When with neck fractures or something like that, knowing the anatomy there, that can leave you paralyzed. It can stop, we always have this thing, and when I'm teaching members, C3, 4, and 5 keep you alive, which is because it controls, it has the nerves that control your diaphragm. Right. So if that goes, you stop breathing. And there's more, obviously, information that happens in there, but we have to take into context that your character may not know the amount of trauma that the body went through with the adrenal response, or if they were trying to help someone else, like if they're reaching for another character to save them, they would be so focused on that, they themselves may not have that idea of, oh, I'm closer to death's door than I know.
I mean, just simple things. My brother broke his arm in high school. He was playing basketball. He fell. Someone fouled him, and he tripped and fell and landed with his hands down and broke his arm, and got up and continued to play, and didn't even notice that it happened. And then, the coach calls him over and he's like, stop dribbling the ball with that arm. Like, there's something wrong with your arm. And they end up taking him to the hospital. Now, parallel here, my son broke his arm.
Oh.
and screamed and cried immediately.
Yeah.
And so everybody reacts differently. Like he knew, my son was like, ouch. But my brother had no idea that this was going on. He just continued to play because the adrenaline of the game had him to a point where he was just like, okay, I'm just gonna get up and keep playing, and didn't even notice that this was happening. He was walking around playing with a broken arm. Bodies are weird things.
And we've said a lot of things that shows and books do wrong today, but one of the things that I've always thought was great was you'll have a scene where someone is fine at a hospital, and then you get the cut scene to them expiring off camera because something took a turn. And I've seen folks complain like, it feels like a cheap trick. I'm like, no, that's life though. That's life, like where somebody can be totally okay 1 minute and a blood clot takes the wrong turn, some small little spark inside you where things go left when it should have gone right. And it's over. And we've talked about how resilient we are, but the human body, when it decides to shut down, can decide to shut down in a literal heartbeat too. So
in more unexpected ways than we may care to, I guess, show, especially aligning that when culture and emergencies are integrated deeply, because with certain cultures, due to whatever they've had inculcated over years, they will never say that they are in pain. Culture, different external factors. I've seen patients not only do, for example, male and female present differently because of the way our pain sensors are. It's also culturally, if something is not culturally acceptable, the help is not something that's asked for or permitted in certain cases. So with that being said, taking that into context, someone may very well have that left turn really quickly because it was never sensed, felt, vocalized, help was not asked for, services weren't asked for during that duration of distress, because at that moment it didn't feel distressing. And
that's the personal or cultural perspective of the person going through it. Like it's their reaction to go, that's nothing. And another person, it's fine. Yeah, nobody's ever fine. and it's that, and there's nothing else you could do because that's so internal. It's like, I get a little bit of a headache, go to bed, never wake up, and it happens every day. And it's so, we all, allegedly have the same, 10 fingers, 10 toes, 1 heart, 2 lungs, all that stuff, but it's every single one of us runs differently. We're all bespoke machines, and so and there's nothing we can do to predict it. It's wild. It's part of what makes us amazing, but part of what makes writing about emergency so scary for writers too is it's always a unique experience.
That is, I think, the perfect point to say. I want you guys to give me your final thoughts and tell us if there's anything you want to advertise. I feel like for Joy that might not be a thing, but if you want to, like, social media or whatever, share with us. So I'm going to say Matt to go first.
Sure. Matthew Phillion, MatthewPhillion.com is where you can find stuff about my books, or wherever books are sold. I'm at Matt Phillion on Twitter if you ever want to talk shop. I love talking about books and writing and healthcare and stuff, so feel free to find me there, and I'm always happy to chat. And I Joy, I think you should be a consultant. This has been amazing listening to you. Like, if you don't have a fiction project that you're working on yourself, I think you should put yourself out there as a consultant. You are amazing to discuss this stuff.
Thank you.
This is why I pick her brain and say, hey, Joy, if my character is bleeding on a sidewalk for a blank amount of time from this injury, how would they react to that? Like, are they still alive? What's going on?
Usually, like, if they took this medication and ate garlic. And believe it or not, that's something that does happen. Foods and medicines can jack you up. So that does happen. I'm like, and I get a call and I'm like, why are you asking? I'm like, is this real or is this a story? And is this a story, wink, wink story? Like I should be going to your house?
If I had a quote character do this.
If a friend, and I'm like, is the friend named you?
Do you mean like the time I accidentally took my son's medication for anxiety and my own?
No.
I was just doling out medicine for the day, right? Like I'm like, okay, for me and for you and for me. And usually when it's for me, I just pop it and then I put his out for him to take, and I just popped the wrong one. And I was like, wait a second. I did something wrong here. Anyway.
that makes the time I took the nighttime cold medicine at 8 o'clock in the morning so much less of a story. Like, is that so, like that's just going back to bed as opposed to like taking the wrong anxiety medicine.
It turns out that all that did was just make me really, really mellow.
Oh, perfect. Hey,
that's the type of med. So
a great day.
Don't take that as advice or anything.
Nothing matters today. I'm perfectly calm.
You're like, Doc, do you think this combo would be in my future plans?
Okay,
fine. Prescribe both at the same
I don't think
time?
I'd ever get anything done if I was that mellow. This would not be happening if I was that mellow all the time. Sorry, Joy, I messed up your sign off. Go ahead.
Oh, no, it's totally fine. So I'm Joy Garcia. I think for me, I would say overall, I am not in all of the places and all of the things yet. On social media, I'm only on Instagram, predominantly Simple Life 11. And I will be expanding that shortly so I can update Justine so she'll be able to share that with you guys. And most of the time it's usually travel and things I'm doing with the city. And I want to add to more things of that, and yoga, because I try to balance the mind, body, spirit as much as I can. And with that being said, just utilize all of anything that you want to support your ideas with, utilize all of your resources. There are so many things that I've seen, and maybe we can talk about emergencies or medicine or whatever you want to create. But if you can utilize and integrate everything and make it more relatable, I would love to read everyone's things and add it to my lovely library of life. So please just share those things, utilize the equipment, utilize the wonderful body, the anomalies, all of the things. It's going to be great. And I'm sure you have more resources. Justine's definitely one of them. Matt's another. I look forward to seeing more from everyone.
Well, that has been our panel for today. Thank you guys for joining me. If you want more content like this, you can check out all the wonderful videos available on this YouTube channel. For now, if you're watching this live during the conference, please join us for the live Q&A over on the WriteHive Discord. Thank you for joining us today.